The 2026 NFL schedule just dropped, and I got a lot of issues with this schedule. Is it fair? Is it equitable? Who has got the upper hand as a result of what the NFL did from a rest and preparation and strength of schedule aspect for 2026? Let's dig into it. All right, everybody, welcome in. I am joined by Ray Summerlin. This is Sharp Football Analysis, and we are going to be breaking down the 2026 NFL schedule release. And if you guys have been following me for any period of time longer than 1 year, you know that this is something that I dive into deeply. I've been doing it since I want to say 2021, and unfortunately, it has been getting worse and worse almost every single year. But this year is historic in a number of areas. There are some things that the NFL did which will get applauded, which is going to get some positivity from me. But there are some things that I've got to, call a spade a spade. They did some things in this schedule that are historically bad, that are creating problems for the future as it relates to balance amongst all 32 teams from a rest perspective. We're going to talk about whether that's a thing or not. Does rest actually matter? We're going to dive into that. We're going to talk about which teams got screwed, which teams benefit from the way that the NFL planned out their games, because they don't control who you play, but they do control when you play those teams. We're going to break all of that down here in this outstanding show. But before we get into that, Ray, I've got to mention to everybody that we are running a special over at Sharp Football Analysis. You can get 15% off this 2026 football preview. This is last year's edition. This year's probably going to be around 600 pages is my guess. This was 550 pages, diving through all 32 teams with the chapter on every single team, getting you ready for the season. Go to sharp.football, enter code schedule. You can get 15% off of that. We're going to talk about our futures and some of the betting packages that we've got on sale a little bit later in the show, but just want to get that out in front of you. Ray, I know you do a lot of work reading my analysis each year. It's a big focus. The NFL tried to screw us by moving the schedule release one day later, tried to push us into the weekend. We were able to beat them. We got out the analysis on Friday afternoon, but things have settled down a little bit for you from editing all the stuff that I'm typing. What are your general thoughts about the schedule before we dive into some of the details here?
Well, I like the conspiracy mindset you have that they moved it to a Thursday to push us into the weekend. I'm a big fan of that. I spend enough time on Reddit that obviously I'm going to be a big fan of things like that. I mean, yeah, it's another schedule release. My overall thought about it has always been, for the last several years, is that the NFL has managed to make an event out of releasing their schedule, which is just like, that's no other league in the world can top that. It really is spectacular on their part. Good for them. But I have, since coming here, I guess we're going to my fourth season here at Sharp, maybe something like that, third or fourth season. I definitely am paying more attention to the schedule release than I previously did. And a lot of that's the work that you do with, our rest edges, with looking at where is the schedule fair, where is it not so fair. And what I think is interesting is that we have seen over the last couple of years now, the NFL come out and push back against this notion that this stuff even matters. At least publicly, they're expressing the opinion that these rest differences matter. Do they think that in private? We don't know. But at least publicly, they are expressing the opinion that these rest differences, these rest factors that you write about do not matter. Obviously, you disagree with that. And so I guess the question is, why do you disagree with that?
Yeah, look, if you convince someone that rest doesn't matter at all in athletics, then you have carte blanche to do whatever you want with the schedule, right? Like what's to stop you from giving a particular team 8 games where they're playing at a rest disadvantage and giving another team 35 days where they're playing with rest advantages total across the entire season? Like nothing is to stop you, because you can just say, well, we haven't seen any reason to believe that rest actually matters. We're going to dive into it from a lot of different bases to try to talk about this before we dig into the details as to how historic this schedule is from a rest perspective. But the one thing that let's just start with the common sense before we dig into some of the actual numbers. From a common sense perspective, if you're approaching a coach or you are coaching a team, and you could say, you get your choice. Ray, you get your choice. You can either play this next opponent with 2 days less rest than they have, or you could play the same opponent with 2 days more rest than they have. Why would you give up that rest? Aren't you almost always going to take, if not 100% of the time, take more rest because it could help your players recover? It could give you a little bit more time to prepare. It will make sure that if one of the other team's players gets injured in a game, they have less ability to actually play in that game against you. There's a multitude of factors that would be to your benefit to take a little bit of extra rest for a particular game. I don't know who would choose to have voluntarily less rest heading into a game. Even if you didn't think that rest actually mattered that much, why would you just choose to take the less rest unless you have some sort of data that rest actually hurts, right? Which I don't think anybody believes that rest hurts. We'll talk about bye weeks and how that introduction has caused a little bit of rust at times, and that should be treated a little bit separately. But in general, that is not something that I think coaches would be willing to choose to take less rest. In addition, if you look at, I'll just look at a single factor handicap is sometimes what we call these things. If you take road teams after week 6 over the last decade, we're talking about over 500 game sample size here. Road teams over the last decade. And the only thing we're going to change is whether you have over 6 days of rest or less than 6 days of rest. The standard is 6 days. You're going to have more or you're going to have less than that. That's the single factor that we're going to change here. If you're a road team, since over the last decade, you are 192 and 168 ATS. That's 53.3% if you have over 6 days of rest. That is a positive 1.8% ROI. If you have less than 6 days of rest, that's the only thing we were changing here. You now have less than 6 days of rest. You drop to 113 and 126 ATS. That is 47.9% ATS. That is minus 8.6% ROI. That is a swing of over 10% ROI from having extra rest to having less rest. And that's all that we've changed. I don't see how you could say rest is completely irrelevant given data like that, focusing on when rest matters a little bit more, which is later on in the season when injuries are likely to pile up and teams are more likely to be tired and gassed. And that's when rest would matter a little bit more. So for those two factors alone, I think it's clear that rest does play a role. The question is to what degree. To say that we can't pinpoint the exact degree so it doesn't matter, I think is the wrong way to approach it. But that's what the league is looking to do here with their assertion that, and this really started because I listened to Mike North at the NFL. He's a VP of scheduling, comes out every year after the schedule drops on Ross Tucker's show and talks about what they're doing with the schedule. And this year specifically, it was the first time that I've heard them outright say that they don't believe rest actually matters. And so as a result of that, I think that's what they're now leaning into to give them the ability to do what they want in terms of benefiting the league overall while impacting certain teams in a negative way.
And I do, so like my point, my thought just as like a, I'm trying to play like I'm hearing all this for the first time role. I think it's interesting that you talk about against the spread numbers. And I wanted you to dig a little bit deeper on why that matters. Why were we not just looking at just straight up record of those teams? Why is it more important to look at it from an against the spread and a return on investment kind of lens?
Because the spread is the great equalizer in analyzing matchups between two teams. It sets an expectations. It sets the bar for what we are expecting to occur. And this is not an arbitrary number. Millions and millions of dollars are bet in a market to move this number constantly every second of the day, 24 hours a day, until that game kicks off. And so we have an actual market with real money being invested, professionals who are hired, work full-time, make good money, setting these numbers, who do it at an expert level, and then the bettors can bet into that market. And as a result, that is really like the ground, the bar you have to clear. If you are going to exceed expectations, you're going to cover the spread more. If you're going to fall short of expectations, you're going to lose against the spread. You're going to return that negative ROI. And bettors know that they have to beat 52.38%, which is minus 110 standard juice, in order to see profit betting on games with minus 110 juice on both sides. Now, the thing about betting is, and this is like a great, I don't know, like example that I would say from these, talk to any sharp bettor, talk to anybody who actually builds their own models or bets into markets, or ask anybody who actually sets the lines, anybody who works at a sports book and set the lines. Here's one example. Let's say that the NFL decided to change how they were going to operate with regards to when they were going to play the Super Bowl. 10 days after the NFC Championship game, they would play the Super Bowl. But they would wait to kind of occupy that time and play the AFC Championship game 5 days later. 5 days of rest for the AFC team before the Super Bowl, 10 days of rest for the NFC team before the Super Bowl. If you knew that the NFC team was going to have an extra 5 days of rest over the AFC team, that line would be accounting for that. There would be a line movement that would account for the fact that that was the case. The market would set that from the guys who are setting the lines. The bettors would account for that fact. And so to say that rest doesn't matter would be completely wrong in terms of what the books would say, as well as the sharpest bettors would say, if that were to be the case. The other thing would be, let's pretend, even if, because the football is not round, bounces funny directions, a 10-game sample over 10 years, let's pretend they played the Super Bowl out 10 years. And the AFC team just happened to win it 5 times and the NFC happened to win it 5 times. So you might say, oh, well, the rest doesn't matter. Look, we can't really discern that rest is benefiting the team. Do you think that in the 11th year, they're just going to ignore the fact that one team has double the rest? No, they're still going to account for it to some degree in the lines that they set for that next game. Here's another example that I'll throw out there from a betting perspective and a line making perspective. If you were asking a sports bettor or a book, like how much is, let's say we're going to eliminate, because we want to talk averages here. So let's say we're going to eliminate the top, let's say 10 players at each position. Don't look at those players. Let's look at the rest of the league. The average starter at, linebacker, he misses the game. Is the market going to adjust? Is a point spread going to shift for that guy missing the game? Probably say no. If a safety, a random average safety misses a game, is the market moving for that? No, the market's not going to even move a cent for that. If a number 2 wide receiver misses a game, the market's not moving. If a starting guard misses a game, the market's not moving. Now, what happens if 2 offensive linemen, your right tackle and your right guard, both miss the game? Well, then we're talking cluster injuries on the offensive line. Maybe you've got a left-handed quarterback. It could be his blind side. Maybe that market should adjust for that injury. Maybe it might move, but no more than a half a point, right? But here's one funny thing that I heard this week, Ray, is that some of the people that are saying that the rest doesn't matter think that the rest for like a Thursday game could be just only a half a point. Like a half a point doesn't really matter. Like it's only a half a point probably that it's worth. So it doesn't really matter. That's the equivalent of losing the entire right side of your offensive line for a game is what a half a point could be worth. So I think they underestimate like the actual value of what a half a point is worth. To just say that it's not that meaningful because it sounds small doesn't really showcase how meaningful and valuable that is for bettors, for lines makers, the difference between 2.5 or 3. And I know that's often on a key number, but So that one is worth a little bit more, but a half a point for the most part is still very valuable in the NFL, whether you're professionally betting on it or whether you're setting lines. And to just ignore that because that's what they say, oh, Thursday night games, having that mini buy is worth a half a point. I just think that's a silly argument. So I think from an ATS betting perspective, a lines maker perspective, a professional bettor perspective, it is very clear that having little edges matters. And for the NFL to make it sound like none of this matters at all, I think is a little bit insulting to a degree, because we know that it does matter, and it's just how much does it matter? And to give them carte blanche to do whatever they want, I think is the wrong move here. But that's what's happening moving forward, Ray, because the last point I want to make on this is the way that I believe that they're currently building out the schedule. Obviously, there's guardrails, what they can, what they'll permit, what they won't permit. They did a good job. They took out 3 games in 10 days. They removed that. They only have one team that plays 4 games in 17 days. They reduced the negated bye weeks. Like, there were some things that they were doing this year, clearly, that they were trying to improve upon some player safety issues. So credit for them making those moves. However, that being said, when you are talking about what their priority is, I think their model looks at the matchups, which we know the matchups. We knew the matchups when the season ended last year of 2025 in January. We knew all 272 matchups this year. What they've been doing is they've been trying to figure out, when this team plays that team, how many people will watch the game if we put it here versus we put it there. These are all assets. So they're trying to shift them around, put them on different primetime slots, or 4 p.m. Eastern time on Fox, or standalone games on international games, wherever they do. They're moving these different assets around. They're trying to figure out how can they stack a schedule that's going to get the most eyeballs on it. That's what they're building towards. It's not to try to balance it out. They're just trying to look at this point in 2026, how can we get a schedule that will get the most volume of viewers watching it? Because when we have the highest volume, then I can go to Netflix and I can say, this game on Thanksgiving, the 8 p.m. game on Thanksgiving evening, we believe that that's going to get 30 million people watching it. And we believe this other game will get 25 million people watching it. And so they then can bid on it, just like other networks. I want to bid on this. I want to bid on, and then it just makes the NFL more money. So that's how they're building the schedule, in my opinion, right now, is solely based on projected viewership for the games. That's why our Thanksgiving schedule is sick. I mean, that's a great schedule. You and I, Ray, might not. I don't know about your opinion. I got to ask you. Do you like the Thanksgiving Eve game? Because I being a content producer, I think that's a bit much. I think that's a lot to do. Then we got the Black Friday game. Yeah. But the games themselves are great. Like, they have really stacked those games, but it's all about just making money. It's not about trying to create fairness or equity in the schedule.
Yeah, and I think this is actually one of the things I wanted to discuss with you. First of all, I do think I want to make this point, is you mentioned, as we're talking about, does this matter? You're talking about against the spreads, which is a really good way of just, these were the expectations. This is what actually happened. That's why this matters. But I think your point, and I just want to make it here just to make sure it's clear, is that even with odds makers taking into account something like a short week road game, especially later in the season, where we should have maybe a line movement away from the team that's on a short week playing a road game, still those teams have performed below expectations against the spread. So even though the lines do move in response to those teams are still, if those lines didn't move, then those numbers look a little bit different, which I think is interesting. I want to talk a little bit about this notion, because I do think that even if you intend it or not, talking about this in terms of what teams were helped and what teams were hurt, what teams were screwed, which is I know a term that you've used. That's a fun YouTube thumbnail. Your team got screwed by the schedule, so I support that fully. But talking about it in those terms does tend to lead towards like a morality conversation. Like this, it's unfair to this team. It's fair to this team. And I do think that that's a reasonable conversation to have. And I do think it's something that fans should care about. But to your point about what the NFL is trying to do is to make as much money as possible. And who are they trying to make that money for? Well, they're trying to make that money for the owners of these teams. So if the teams didn't want this to happen, if the organizations didn't want this to happen, and it's difficult, it's always difficult with sports, is you have to separate the ownership group from, obviously the GM and coach want to win, because if they don't win, they'll lose their job. That's really important. The players want to win and do well, because if they don't win and do well, they're going to lose their job. They have motivation for this to matter to them. But ultimately, the people making the decisions here are the owners, right? And the owners, what do they want? Well, some of them want to win. All of them probably want to win a little bit, but this is the age-old, like, push and pull between fans and ownership, right? Is that even the best owners that the fans are most happy with, they want to win, but they also want to make money. And if you gave even the best owner in the NFL, say, and we're just going to come up with a number, I'm not saying this is what the schedule is getting for them, but let's say you can either make $50 million more this year, or your team could win the Super Bowl. I think a larger number than fans would like would take $50 million. And so ultimately, this is a problem that if the teams wanted to fix it, they could fix it, because they control the schedule. They control Roger Goodell. He works for them, right? And ultimately, that this is where we're going suggests that this is not a priority to them. That doesn't mean it shouldn't be a priority to us. Knowing this is important for us and for what we do, it's important for fans. And fans certainly should get mad about it if you're a fan of the Chargers, for instance, that this continues to happen to your team. You should be mad at this. But it's another one of those, to me, this conversation seems like one of those classic fans versus ownership, players versus ownership situation, where you're like, yeah, it's not fair, but do the owners actually care? And if they don't, then I'm going to have a hard time getting up in arms about the fairness of it, versus just, hey, we need to know this information so that we can make better decisions once we get there.
Yeah, you make a great point. I do not think this is changing. I don't think this is improving. No amount of analysis is really going to improve it, because they've realized how much money they can make by making the best schedule that'll get the most people watching the games. And so that is going to trump any of this other discussion about rest equity, especially when that very same league that is making the owners more money by putting these schedules out that have the most competitive games in the best time slots is simultaneously telling the league rest doesn't matter. Rest disparity doesn't matter. It's not, we can't really measure the exact impact of it. So just don't worry about it. Let us just go about crazily making the schedule that we think is going to make the most money for us and ignore that other factor. So the owners are going to be like, okay, I got to trust him. He just made me an extra, $10 million last year with the TV deals. So I'm just going to ignore the fact that, like, maybe this could actually be hurting some of the teams, because maybe this year it's not going to hurt me. And so I don't really have to care that much about it. But like, if we want to break down some of the quick numbers in terms of what rest specific factors matter most, if you just look at over the last, I already shared the single game factor from road games after week 6, whether you have rest or you don't, you're making money betting the teams that do, you're losing money, significant money, in fact, betting the teams that don't have more rest. Here's another couple. Over the last decade, teams with a 3 to 6 day rest edge, when they're not off of a full bye, which we'll talk about in a second, they are covering the spread 55% of the time with 4.2% ROI. That's over 233 games. And that's the only factor in there. The last decade, 3 to 6 day rest advantage, not off of a bye. Now, the reason that we're not off of a bye is because the 2011 CBA changed the bye so that it was mandatory 4 days off after during every single bye week. And so the players, I was talking to Ross Tucker about this earlier today. The players, Ray, they go on, they're planning this ahead of the season. They know when their bye is. They know they're going to get 4 days off. So they're booking travel. They're figuring out where they can go. Like in May, when the schedule comes out, they already start thinking about that. And so when you've got, like, you think about it, anytime, it doesn't really get that cold where you live, but you're thinking about it's freezing cold in like January or February, and you're thinking about booking your summer vacation to the Bahamas or to Aruba or Cancun or wherever you want to go. Like, that's on your mind. 2 weeks out, 3 weeks out, 1 week out. Okay, now I get to you've been looking forward to this trip, and players now, they have more money than they've had before due to the contracts and in part the TV, and it's easier to travel. And so it's not like it was back in the day. These guys can pick up and just go wherever they want at the drop of the dime and go have their fun and stay until the last second and then get back into town. And it does throw off that schedule. And we've seen it in the results. It used to be like from 2000 to 2010, teams after a bye week were covering 56% of the time. It was like a great situation to be aware of and to bet with. But since the 2011 CBA, teams after a bye week have won just 52% of their games outright. From a spread perspective, only 48.9% will they cover games. That's minus 6.6% ROI. It's dropped to minus 7.9% over the last decade. So full off bye weeks with 4 mandatory days off have hurt. The 2020 CBA introduced mandatory time off during mini buys, but the data that I've looked at from a spread perspective has shown that the results from a covering rate have gotten even better since 2020 for the teams off of mini buys than they even were before that. So the mini buy CBA hasn't really decreased or diminished the impact of that mini buy, but that is where we're seeing the best edge for teams. And as a result, I mean, look, I got the my graphic here, and you can pull this up if you guys want to see it right now. This is the 2026 rest edges. A team like the Miami Dolphins plays, you can see them there, fifth from the bottom, sixth from the bottom, minus 6 days net rest. Each box on the screen, and I'm showcasing this graphic for those of you listening. You could go over to sharpfootballanalysis.com and check out the full article, and you could see this graphic there as well. But each box on this graphic represents a single game where there's either a rest advantage or a rest disadvantage. The number of days, positive numbers are the number of days that you have a rest advantage. Negative numbers are the days you have a rest disadvantage. The Miami Dolphins are playing 5 games against teams off of mini buys. So they've got -3, -3, -3, 3 different times, -2, -2, 2 different times. So they're -6 overall, but they're playing a lot of these mini buy teams, whereas some teams like the Philadelphia Eagles play 4 opponents off of full bye weeks and only one other game where they have a 1-day rest disadvantage. So it's important to understand the situations, but the bottom line is the data is showcasing that while buys don't matter as much, mini buys, smaller time frames do still matter as it relates to performance when you are dealing with having extra rest as compared to your opponent. And it's something to factor in. And, you know, I'm certainly not going to look. The NFL could do what it wants to. I'm not taking any offense that they're not listening to my analysis. I don't care what they do. I will use this from a betting perspective happily. We've had a lot of success betting on teams from a futures perspective, from a full, individual game perspective, which are the 2 ways that you can use rest. And we put every single rest advantage or disadvantage in the book for all 32 teams, all 17 games. We listed in the book. And, from a futures perspective, I'll just might as well just say this right now, Ray. We've won on futures for seven straight years. We've hit 65% each of the last 2 years in our futures package. And you can get that 15% off using code SCHEDULE over at Sharp.football. Go there. You can get the futures package for 15% off. But at any rate, if they don't want to do this, I don't think they're going to, then we'll just take advantage of it. I'm not trying to get them to change. I'm just trying to make this clear to everybody that I do think it's a factor.
So we brought up that graphic that showed the net rest edge, which is just very simply how many times you have less rest, or how many days of less rest versus how many days of more rest do you have. Add them together, see where you end up. You can head over, like Warren said, to sharpfootballanalysis.com, see the full article, see the full graphic if you're listening to us via podcast. If you are doing that, by the way, head over to YouTube and hit subscribe, and you can see this graphic right now. We can see the teams. We see the Bears at the top of this, plus 15, the Bills plus 14, the Cowboys plus 12. Then we got those teams at the bottom, like you mentioned, the Eagles minus 15, the Chargers minus 24. We're going to talk specifically about the Chargers and kind of, some of the issues that they're going to face from a rest perspective. But I do think it's interesting that this is only one of the elements of rest that you talk about is this net rest edge. You've brought up some of the other ones, short week road games. That one is one that, that's one I've been following and betting on for, I feel like 15 years now, way back to the old days of killer sports, when you would look up data in that database, right? So doing that one for a while. You mentioned the 3 games in 10 days, 4 games in 17 days. We've kind of gotten away from that mostly, although we will talk about the Bills here in a little bit. What are some other ones that you're paying attention, other than short week road games, that 3 and 10, 4 and 17? What else kind of goes into your overall rest and prep rankings?
Yeah, so I look at games after playing on the road, Sunday night or Monday night. Those are challenges, getting back into town. You're coming in, let's say you're playing on a Sunday, but you played on a Monday night before. Yes, you have one day of less rest. However, you get into town on a Tuesday morning, you might be playing an opponent who played on Sunday. That opponent shows that they have their standard rest, but really, as it compares to you playing on Monday night while they played at Sunday at 1 p.m., that's well over a day and a half of extra rest. And so that's a benefit to that team in terms of when you're getting home and the detriment that would cause for you. You discussed the short week road games, opponents' days to prepare for your game, when you have less rest or more rest than your opponent in general. So if we want to bring up, let's talk about some of these in totality, and let's start with net rest edge. So if you want to bring up the graphic that just looks at this, this is fine, the comparison graphic here. What I did here is I wanted to show how much worse this year was than last year. And like I said, I've been digging into these charts and tables and data for over 5 years now. And the graphic at the top of the screen, if you're watching us on YouTube, is 2025's net rest edge. And the graphic at the bottom of the screen is this year's net rest edge. You could see how much wider the graphic at the bottom is, which illustrates how much worse some of these teams are getting screwed by the NFL by having more days with rest disadvantages or more days with rest advantages, and the haves and the have-nots. Take, for example, we want to go back to the 2026 only. Okay. Look at the Tennessee Titans in the middle of the screen. They are one of 3 teams that play 1 game with a rest disadvantage or fewer. They play 0 games with a rest disadvantage. Meanwhile, you've got a team like the Chargers that plays 7 games with a rest disadvantage. Is that fair in a season to play? Have one team play 7 games with a rest disadvantage and another team play 0 games with a rest disadvantage? This does not mean that the Titans are going to win more games than the Chargers per se. It's just a fact that has to be accounted for and spelled out, made obvious. Now, one of the things, Ray, the other aspect to this, that the reason I started talking about this in the first place was not because it was something I was eager to look into. I was told to look into it. With some of my connections with 2 different owners, multiple general managers, and then down to some coaches as well, looking into different aspects of the schedule for certain teams that were not happy with the way that the league was divvying up aspects of their schedule for either them directly or their opponents, in some cases thinking that their opponents were getting benefit. This was back in the 2019, 2020, 2018 timeframe. Then once I started digging into other things with the schedule, then that's when some of these other things became more obvious and clear. And I started going down this whole rabbit hole. So that's where we got started with this. But if you look at, let's see, some of those general key facts, we're looking at this year, the Chicago Bears have plus 15 days of net rest. That is the number 2 largest net rest edge since 1990. Talking about some of the historic nature of this schedule. Simultaneously, while the Bears have the 2nd largest net rest edge since 1990, the Chargers have the number 1 largest net rest disadvantage since 2013, the number 4 largest since 1990. They're at minus 24 days of rest disadvantage, net rest disadvantage. You combine the 2 together, You have plus 15 for the Bears, minus 24 for the Chargers, a 39-day delta between the best and the worst teams. That is the number one largest delta for any NFL season since 2000. We're talking 27 years. That is why this graphic is as wide as it is. I was talking about that before when I was comparing it to 2025. Games with any sort of rest advantage. This year, there will be 110 games played where one team has a rest advantage over their opponent. The schedule only has 272 games on it. We're talking 40% of the games this year will feature a rest advantage for one team over their opponent. That is the most we have ever seen in NFL history. In terms of those larger advantages, we are going to see 69 games, a very nice number, where a team has at least 3 days of rest advantage over their opponent. That is the number one highest total in NFL history as well. So just adding a little bit of historical perspective to this before we keep rolling on here, that is why I am saying that this schedule is historic. Now, if you bring back up that schedule, I want to talk last year real quick. Last year, 2025, there were 5 teams that had over 7 days of positive net rest. If you squint, you can see them there at the top. The Seahawks won 14 games. The Rams won 12. The Niners won 12. The Lions won 9. And the Dolphins won 7. That is an average of 10.8 wins for the teams that were top 5 in net rest edge last season. 2 of those 5 teams made it to the NFC Championship. One of them made it to the Super Bowl and then won the Super Bowl, the Seattle Seahawks. On the opposite side of the spectrum, the 3 teams with the worst net rest edge, those that received over 7 days of negative net rest edge, those were the Raiders, Commanders, and Saints. None of them won more than 6 games. The average was 4.7 wins, and they all had pretty terrible years. Now, rest alone, Ray, as you know, was not the reason that the Seattle Seahawks won the Super Bowl or why the Rams won 12 games. It just so happened that teams in the NFC West had great rest situations. The Raiders were going to be bad anyways. We bet their win total under. That was a snoozer. The Raiders were going to be bad anyways. They only won 3 games last year. It wasn't just because of rest that they struggled, but it is a factor. It was part of the reason. What degree, it's hard to say specifically, but it was part of the reason why some of those teams did really well and some of these teams did really poorly.
So I think that's a good springboard into talking about some of these individual teams. You've already, brought up a couple of them. I'm really interested in the Chargers, both because this is a team I'm doing it again, Warren. I'm in on the Chargers again, and I don't feel great about it. But we're back in on the Chargers. Obviously, like a lot of what they've done over the offseason, Mike McDaniel getting him in there. We're liking that. They were good last year before, the entire offensive line fell apart. Better offensive line help. Please just do it once for us, Chargers. But you look at the schedule and you say, well, that's not great. But I thought what was more interesting. And I do want to talk about a little bit the bye weeks, because I do think they were facing 4 teams off bye, and that inflates this number a little bit. But as we talked about previously, bye weeks maybe don't matter as much as they once did. But what I think is interesting here with the Chargers is that this has been a consistent theme with them for several years in a row now.
Yeah, this is part of it. I think the NFL could do a better job. I was asked by an interviewer for WTOP, which is a big news station in DC, about what the league could do to improve things overnight if they wanted to. And, obviously they could easily make their guardrails a little bit more narrow as to what they would allow from a rest disparity. And then I think things would move more smoothly. But how do you not right some of the wrongs that have occurred with some of these teams year over year? This is where I talk about knowing some of the people within the league. Jobs are on the line. These are people's profession. If you are a offensive coordinator for a team that has dog shit rest for a year or 2 in a row, and your head coach happens to get fired, and then you're out without a job, you could have been like the next head coach in waiting when you first were hired for that position. Now you'll be lucky if you get another OC job. So it does affect the trajectory of people within the league when teams lose games, in part because the NFL didn't care to balance things out at all as it relates to rest. We saw that with the Chargers head coach a couple of years ago. What was that guy's name? I've slipped my brain. At any rate, the Chargers do rank number 32 in my prep and rest rankings this year. But to your point, this is now in the 7 seasons since 2020, they've had positive net rest only one time. One time since 2020. This year is like all-time bad. This is the number 2 largest since 2000 in terms of the negative net rest. They have a whopping 7 games with rest disadvantages this year. That is the most for the Chargers at any season in their franchise history. Only one other time since 1998 has a team received at least 7 games with a rest disadvantage. So from a number of games perspective, not just a total days, it's also pretty historic, at least in modern NFL time period. They play, as you said, 4 teams that are coming off of bye. They also play the Bills and the Ravens coming off of mini buys, which is important to mention those opponents because these are teams they're going to be competing with in the AFC, the Bills and the Ravens. And the Bills and Ravens both have the advantage there playing the Chargers off of a mini bye, which we do think helps. In total, the Chargers play 6 games against opponents who have over 7 days to prepare for them, more than any other team in the NFL. And it's just a very interesting schedule from a rest perspective. They also play the number 2 toughest schedule in the NFL from week 3 onward. So they open with a cupcake Cardinals and Raiders back-to-back weeks, both of them at home. Push those off to the side. You took out 2 home games against really easy opponents. You're now going to be playing a lot more road games against more difficult competition, the number 2 toughest schedule of opponents. Meanwhile, you're dealing with the worst rest edge that we have seen in decades. So it's just a tough thing for the Chargers to overcome. And to your point, like if they're going to have some success, we like some of the things they've done from a team building and a coaching perspective, they're going to have to get it done in poor rest situations.
Were you talking about Brandon Staley? Was that the coach?
Yes.
Brandon Staley. I didn't know we were going to
where is he? Where is he now? Right.
He's the defensive coordinator of the Saints, I believe. Our darling Saints. Am I right about that, by the way? Producer Adam, make sure that I'm right about that. I'm pretty sure I am right about that. Let's move on to the Bears. It was interesting with the Bears, not just the big rest edge for them. Obviously, you mentioned how historic this is, but the Bears also have a lot of other factors, it seems, working in their favor, just as we go through all of the things that you include in your rest and prep rankings, right?
100%. If you look at the Bears, number 1 in net rest days, they're at the top of the chart, plus 15. Number 1 in my overall prep and rest rank. Number 1 in total number of games with more rest than their opponent. They play 5 of them. Number 1 in number of games with a rest edge, plus or minus, they're at plus 3. Number 1 in number of games where their opponent has less than a week to prepare for them. They don't have a negated bye week. They don't play any 3-10 or 4-17. So they have the advantage across the board there. So a lot of good things from the Chicago Bears. Now they do play a difficult schedule of opponents. It's the number 6th most difficult schedule of opponents. So that's not going to be easy, but the number 1 easiest rest schedule for them. The interesting aspect here to them is they've had over 8 days of positive net rest edge just one other time, and that was in 2023. Over the last 5 years prior to this year, they've averaged a net rest edge of only 1.4 days. So for them to be at plus 15 is pretty massive. They have 4 games where they play with rest edges of 3 days. We discussed this before, why 3-day rest edges are more impactful than the full bye week. And they're playing some key opponents in the NFC during this time too, Ray. The Seahawks, plus 3 days week 8. The Lions, plus 3 days week 17. They also get a tough game against the Jaguars where they're plus 3 days in week 13. They had just 1 game with plus 3 days or more rest last year, and it was a game that they won outright as an underdog. And speaking of which, like how the Bears have done, since 2020, the Bears have covered 55% of their games when they don't play with a rest disadvantage. That is one of the best marks in the NFL. It's the number 4 best mark in the NFL. When they are playing with a rest deficit of 3 games or more, they are 0-9 straight up since 2020 and 1-8 against the spread. That is the worst mark in the NFL. So when they're in the disadvantageous bucket, this team has been the worst in the NFL. As soon as they get out of that and are playing with even the slightest bit of rest advantage, they have the 4th best ATS record in the NFL. This continued, by the way, last year, even if you just isolate 2025 with Ben Johnson. Chicago went 11-2 straight up, 11-1-1 ATS when they didn't have a rest disadvantage, but they were 0-2 straight up and against the spread when they did have a rest disadvantage of 3 days or more. So the fact that they're at plus 15 this year and they don't play a single game where they're at minus 3 days of rest, and they play 4 of them themselves where they play at plus 3 or better, this is definitely a benefit for the Chicago Bears to help potentially navigate an otherwise difficult schedule, the 6th most difficult schedule of opponents in 2026.
One more team that really stood out to me as interesting that I want to talk about is the Bills, because again, if you're just looking at that big graphic, they rank pretty well in terms of net rest edge. When you're just talking about, all right, how many more days of rest do you have than your opponent? But if you dig, obviously they rank second in that. That's good. But I thought it was interesting as you dug deeper into what the Bills are facing and kind of some of the issues that they have, both in terms of, you know, when they're playing some of their toughest opponents, some of the run that they have, like they're actually not in as great a spot as just having, 14 days of net rest edge would suggest.
Yeah, there's some positives and negatives with the Buffalo Bills schedule that are really interesting to discuss. First of all, they're the only team in the NFL this year that has to play 4 games in 17 days. Now, it's not something you couldn't overcome, but you playing a Monday night game, then back-to-back Sunday games, and then a Thursday game. That's how you cram that number of days, games into such short time frame. They're the only team. The league has tried to take that out. They removed the 3 and 10, but the Bills are the only ones who have the 4 and 17. So that's one factor that they have to play. They are also the only team that has to play 3 short week road games this year. Week 6, they play in Las Vegas after a Monday night football road game in Los Angeles versus the Rams. Now, will the Bills decide just to stay out on the West Coast? Obviously, that's what they should be doing. I haven't heard whether or not they will, but it sort of makes sense that they should. But that would help neutralize some of that to a degree. Week 10, they play in New York after a Monday night football road game in Minnesota. And then week 16, they play in Denver on a Friday, which is Christmas, after having played the Bears the prior Saturday. So 3 short week, only team in the NFL that has to do that. What makes that interesting is that there are 10 teams that don't play any short week road games, including the Chiefs and the Broncos. Those 2 teams only play 1 short week road game. The Bengals play none. So you've got some competition for the Bills at the elite spots in the AFC, where they're going to have to play 3, the only team in the league, and some of these other competitors play 0 or a max of 1. So those are a couple of negatives about the Buffalo Bills schedule. A couple of positives about the Buffalo Bills schedule, in addition to what Ray shared, where they rank as the number 2 best net rest edge in the season at plus 14 days. They play their biggest competition in the AFC with a rest or schedule advantage of some type in every single one of these games. So I've sorted their toughest opponents that they're going to play in the AFC. 11.2 win projections for the Baltimore Ravens. Buffalo has a 7-day rest advantage on the Ravens. The Chiefs are up next. They're expected to win 10.4 games. Rest is identical for this game, but this is a short week home game on Thursday for the Bills. They get to host one of these short week games, which means the Chiefs are playing on the road on a short week. Edge to the Bills. They play the Chargers, who are expected to win 10.3 games. Buffalo is plus 3 days off of a mini bye. They're playing the Patriots, who are expected to win 9.7 games. The first game of the year against the Patriots, no rest advantage. But the second game sees the Bills with the plus 3 day net rest edge after Thanksgiving. And then the Broncos game that I mentioned, the Bills, though they are on a short week road game, they do have a 1 day rest advantage because the Broncos are not playing on the prior Saturday, whereas the Bills are. So that is maybe neutralizing a little bit that game where the Broncos are getting the short week host spot there, and the Bills are on the road. So some positives and negatives with the Buffalo Bills schedule. Overall, I'd say it's a little bit more positive than negative as it relates to the rest and some of the competition in the AFC, but there are a couple of situations that they're going to have to navigate in 2026. And another interesting nugget as it relates to the Bills, which I put into the article, and you can read the details over at sharpfootballanalysis.com. Since 2020, when not playing with a rest disadvantage, the Buffalo Bills have the number one best record in the NFL. Number one best in terms of straight up wins. They're number two best in terms of their ATS record. They have covered 57% of games since 2020 when they don't play with a rest disadvantage. That is a 9.1% ROI, number two best in the NFL. Over that same span, they are 12-16. That's 42.9% ATS when playing with a rest disadvantage. That's negative 18% ROI. Last year, when they had a rest disadvantage, they went 1-5 ATS, 17% cover rate with a rest disadvantage. That's a minus 68% ROI. Buffalo was -7 last year in net rest edge, which ranked 29th. Now they're number 2 in net rest edge this year. So massive change year over year for the Buffalo Bills. And this is one of those things where you can say, oh, we can't find a discernible rest edge by the numbers. Look at the Buffalo Bills. Look at how much they're the best team in the NFL when they have this rest, and when they don't have a rest disadvantage. But for whatever reason, they haven't been able to do well with it. Now, brand new head coach. Could that factor in? Are they going to do some different things from a strength and conditioning perspective? Get ready for these games faster. I imagine a lot of the staff is still there because Joe Brady is just staying internal, and maybe they're keeping some consistency with some of those people. So that remains to be seen. But this has been a team that is at the outer edge of being impacted by rest, basically through the entire Josh Allen tenure, or at least when the Buffalo Bills started getting really good there with Josh Allen in 2020.
So I know you talk about a lot more teams in the article. In fact, I would encourage everybody to head over to sharpfootballanalysis.com and look at those teams. You added more teams to the article on Monday morning, recording this on Monday afternoon. You're a crazy person, so I assume that you might even have some more teams added to the article as we go through here. And obviously, I think the more important note is that all of this is going to factor into the 2026 football preview, which we are all head down working on right now. So make sure that if you haven't pre-ordered that, make sure you pre-order that. We're all knee deep in that. We kind of come up for air around the schedule release, and then we go right back into our little bunkers working on the book. So I guess it's about time to head back there right now.
Unfortunately, I mean, we're busy bees working on this. That's the only way that this can get built, though. Over 550 pages last year of analysis predicting the upcoming season. We nailed so much of this book. I recorded another video. You can find it on the YouTube channel of some of the things that we absolutely crushed in terms of prognostication. It's difficult to predict what's going to happen in seasons, but like I said, we've been releasing futures publicly for 7 years, have never lost. We do so much work in the off season. If you read this book at the beginning of July, which is when it gets published, you will be well ahead of most of the competition as it relates to, you like betting on futures, you like just getting prepared for the season early, you like having a lot of time to read it over the course of the summer. You'll have 2 months where you can just sit back and digest this thing. If you get on board right now using code SCHEDULE, you can get this book for 15% off over at sharp.football. And then, of course, if you're into fantasy and you're looking to draft players and you're looking to play some best ball or what have you, learning more about the teams, the situations, the strength of schedule that they're going to face from a run defense perspective, from a pass defense perspective, how good are the offenses that they might be playing to help predict how much their offense is going to get pushed. There are a variety of things that you could look at, from strength of schedule to rest edges to which players are new, which players are different, and what we think this team is going to look like in 2026. What's their ceiling from a wins perspective, and what could they do in the futures market? We cover all of those bases. So make sure you head over to sharp.football. Don't just get this book over there 15% off using code SCHEDULE, limited time only, but you can also get our futures over there, as well as any betting package. You can get that at a discount. Just use code SCHEDULE at sharp.football. Get your discount today. We've really enjoyed breaking down the schedule. It's been a hectic few days, as Ray mentioned, getting to work on this Thursday, and here we are Monday, but we've analyzed as much as we could to try to get you guys some great insight. And if you like it and you learn something, please do us two favors. Just hit the thumbs up button on this video and subscribe. It takes 1 second. You can do it right now, and it costs you absolutely nothing. You don't need to use a coupon code for that one. Just go and give us a follow to basically show us that this is the type of analysis that you appreciate and that you would like to see in the future, because there aren't that many other outlets that are going to give you a fair and unbiased look at the schedule and give the NFL kudos when there's something good that they did, or appropriately hold them accountable for things that they might be doing that owners and other players within the league and some of the coaches should be aware of, as well as all of us fans. It's something good to be aware of, and it's something that you could potentially use to produce some profit this upcoming season. So hope you enjoyed the episode. See you again soon.
Right.